The story begins with a homeowner who had never asked for trouble but somehow found himself in the crosshairs of an aggressive homeowners association. His property sat just on the edge of a newly built development, a sprawling neighborhood of manicured lawns, copper-paste houses, and a board obsessed with enforcing rules. His land was older, larger, and far different from the pristine uniformity the HOA demanded from its residents. For years, he lived quietly, tending to his property, maintaining his fields, and keeping his small business running from the land he had inherited from his family. It was peaceful, self-sufficient, and exactly the life he wanted. But to the HOA, his land was an eyesore. They couldn't stand that his fences weren't painted in their approved shade of beige, or that his outbuildings didn't match the cookie-cutter designs in their community. Even though his property wasn't part of their association, the board acted as if it was theirs to control. At first, it started with letters. Friendly at first, then increasingly hostile, each stamped with demands of compliance. When he ignored them, fines began piling up. The HOA board decided that if he wouldn't cooperate, they would force his hand. They assessed penalties for everything from the size of his barn to the color of his roof, even for the gravel driveway that had existed decades before their neighborhood was built. The total grew fast. $100 here, $1,000 there, until the number reached an outrageous $250,000. To the board, this was their victory. They believed no one could withstand that kind of financial pressure, and they were certain he would eventually bend, pay, or sell his land at a discount. It was a strategy they had used before on smaller homeowners, and it had worked. But this was not an ordinary homeowner. What the HOA didn't realize was that the land he owned stretched far beyond the house and barn they could see from the road. His family had purchased the property generations ago, long before the HOA existed, long before the development was even a dream on a builder's blueprint. Over the years, the land had been parceled, leased, and sold in creative ways. And in a twist of irony, when the developers had bought the acreage to build the neighborhood, they had unknowingly signed agreements that left certain rights tied to his family. Among those rights was something extraordinary. Through a set of overlooked legal documents, the homeowners still held ownership of the very land beneath the HOA's pristine houses, streets, and clubhouse. The developers had rushed the contracts, desperate to secure financing, and had granted long-term land leases instead of outright sales for certain sections. Most homeowners didn't know it, and the board had certainly never checked. But the paperwork sat in a locked safe, quietly waiting for the day it might matter. That day had arrived. When the HOA delivered their final demand for the $250,000 in fines, the homeowner responded not with payment but with proof. He met them in their own clubhouse, where they had gathered smugly to witness his surrender. Instead, he placed a thick folder of documents on the table. Inside were deeds, contracts, and recorded agreements that traced ownership of the land beneath their neighborhood directly back to him. The room went silent as realization spread. Their houses, their streets, even the clubhouse they were sitting in stood on land they did not fully control. He wasn't just a neighbor to them. He was, in fact, their landlord. Panic set in quickly. The board members who had mocked and bullied him were suddenly pale, shuffling through papers they didn't understand. The homeowner explained calmly that the fines they had stacked against him were meaningless. They had no authority over his land. Worse for them, their own position was compromised. Without his consent, the HOA technically lacked the right to operate on portions of the neighborhood. Every improvement they had built, every fee they had collected, and every rule they had enforced could be challenged under the agreements they had ignored. The threats that had once come from the HOA now flipped back onto them. If he chose, he could demand ground rent from every homeowner in the community. He could revoke access to shared spaces or even challenge the legality of the HOA itself. Their smug power had evaporated in an instant, replaced by fear and desperation. From that moment forward, the board changed its tone. The letters stopped, the fines disappeared, and the harassment ended. For the first time, the HOA treated him with respect. Behind closed doors, they scrambled to cover their mistakes, but the damage was done. Their arrogance had exposed their weakness, and their own ignorance of the land's history had cost them daily. The homeowner, however, had no desire to ruin the lives of the individual families who lived there. He wasn't looking for revenge against innocent neighbors. What he wanted was peace, freedom, and the ability to live on his property without interference. He made that clear. As long as the HOA stayed off his land and stopped their bullying, he would not enforce the rights that allowed him to charge them rent or dissolve their rules. It was a deal they had no choice but to accept. In the end, the HOA that had tried to break him with fines and intimidation had been humbled by their own ignorance. They learned that not everyone could be pushed, and some property owners hold far more power than they ever imagined. The homeowner kept his land, his independence, and his dignity intact, and the HOA, once proud and overbearing, was left with a constant reminder the ground beneath their perfect little neighborhood did not belong to them at all. Do you like HOA stories? Please subscribe for more.